The place where any government course has to begin is by looking at the ideals in which our government is actually founded. And when I first started this, I actually had on the screen ideals of American democracy. And I changed it to ideals of American government because I think it's very misleading when you say American democracy, because we in fact do not have a democracy. We have a republic or a Republican democracy. There are elements of a democracy, but we are not an actual democracy. So, in this section, we're going to be looking at the ideals of the American government. And the first part, we're taking a look, it's just very simple, the conflict that we are looking at. And this really boils down every single political issue that you're going to come across over the course of the next year, but also over the course of the rest of your life, really. And that is the balancing act that happens between government power and the rights of the citizens. A couple of examples that I have. First is something as simple as education. I'm going to start local, where it's where you're more familiar with it. When you're looking at something like education, you as an individual citizen have a choice. You have all chosen to go to a public school. As you will see in coming discussions, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that we have to provide an education for you. But we do, and the state of Kentucky does, and the local Boone County Board of Education does. So as a citizen, it has been pretty much determined universally throughout this country that you have a right to education. However, you do not have the right to choose which school you go to. The Boone County Board of Education and the state of Kentucky have placed restrictions within the boundaries of the Boone County schools. So some of you probably live in an area that is very close to the borderline. I know something like, what is that, Gunpowder Road, right off of Mount Zion. That is like the dividing line between, let's say, Boone County High School and Ryle High School. Hathaway Road is the dividing line between Cooper and Ryle. So the government, the local government, the Boone County Board of Education does have some power in the decision making of where you go to school. You do not just have this open right to go wherever you want to go. And even if you live in Boone County, unless you're, or if you live, yeah, if you live outside of Boone County, you will not be able to go to a Boone County school unless for some reason that your parent works in the district or something like that, or some extenuating circumstance. So in the issue of education at the local level, you will see the balancing act between the rights of the citizens, your rights to obtain an education, but also the government's power in order to dictate where specifically you can go to school. This conflict also presents itself, in the COVID-19 response. And at the time of this recording, we are still in an open phase within the state of Kentucky and within the state of Ohio. However, I believe it was just last week that Governor Beshear came out and he said that restaurants can only operate at 25% capacity within their physical walls. There are no restrictions if you open up outside and you have outdoor seating. So the government power in this case is the governor coming in and using the health department to shut down restaurants that are violating some of these procedures. And if they operate within 50% of capacity, the health department can shut them down. So you're seeing it more kind of transition to the side of government with the COVID-19 response, and the rights of citizens, some people argue, are being violated. A person who has a right to open a business is now being controlled by government power in how they operate that business and certain procedures and practices, and then also how many people they allow in on a given basis. I know in Ohio, they have stopped serving alcohol after, I think it's like 10 o'clock. So there's this balancing act in the COVID-19 response of government power, where government is trying to keep people safe, do the things necessary to try and stop the spread of the coronavirus. But also we have to balance the rights of those citizens. We can't, or at least at this time, don't want to shut down everything and stop that from stop people from having that right to own a business. And I think you are seeing that kind of play out in a lot of the decisions that are being made as schools try to attempt to go back in person to try and balance those rights of the individual along with the government response. Finally, you have the Obergefell versus Hodges case. And if you are not familiar with this, you will be at some point during the year. But this is the case that legalized gay marriage in the United States. Looking at the rights of the citizens and the government power, the question was whether the government could stop somebody or define what a marriage was going to be. And according to the Obergefell versus Hodges case, this was an example of where the rights of the citizens were protected. The government lost some of its power in the sense that Kentucky can no longer outlaw gay marriage because, according to this court case, equal protection is that everybody, you have the right to marry, so whether you're gay or straight. So in this case, you're seeing the rights of the citizens kind of protected and taking some of that government power away. So out of these three examples, you should be able to see how government power and the rights of the citizens are constantly being balanced. And you'll see this as we go further into the discussion. Education is an example of where you have a right, the right of the citizen and the government are being pretty equally balanced and oftentimes maybe seen as a little bit more in the hands of the government power. The COVID-19 response is definitely more in the hands of the government power. And then Obergefell versus Hodges is seen as a way of protecting the rights of those citizens. So the basic conflict that our government is dealing with and the basic ideals center around this idea of should the government have the power or should the citizens? The second part to this conflict can be seen as a triangle here, and it's a constant balancing act between the three ideals. The first ideal is the ideal of equality. If we have 100% equality, you essentially have socialism or communism, meaning that nobody has any extra wealth over another person, nobody is treated unfairly, everything is equal regardless of any ability or anything like that. So equality is one of the things that our government strives to protect, even though there are times that we don't necessarily have that full equality simply because there is also order that we are looking at. Government is also ultimately tasked with trying to maintain order within a society. So you have this equality, and if you have 100% equality, there really is no order in the sense of what we see. One of the things that Donald Trump, as president, was, or as a candidate for the presidency, talked about is he called himself the law and order president, meaning that here's the law, we're going to stick to that law, and we're going to make sure that that law is enforced. Oftentimes with equality, that might not be the case. So order is going to be the government maintaining the order. Order is going to be strict adherence to the law, whatever that law may be. And then finally, you have liberty. Liberty being the third ideal, and total freedom for the American people. If you have 100% liberty, you will not have equality. If you have 100% liberty, you will not have order. Liberty is total freedom. If there is 100% liberty, you essentially will have anarchy. Obviously we are not in that particular case, but this is the central conflict that government is constantly trying to deal with. We're trying to maintain equality. You're trying to look at liberty, and you're trying to maintain order. You take a look at even one of the most controversial issues over the last 6 months, and that was the George Floyd case. You have these three things presenting itself in the entire conflict that happened there. First, you have police officers whose main task, whether as controversial as this kind of example could be, you have police officers whose main task is to maintain order. However, you have a group of people within the United States that feel that they are not being equally treated by the police officers. And then ultimately you have people who are guaranteed liberty in the actions that they take and the decisions that they make. And you're trying to balance the three of these. If it's too much order, then the police officers essentially are going to have a lot more power than if it's going to be 100% equality. So the basic conflict of government is trying to outline or balance, I should say, the three qualities of order, equality, and liberty. The last part of, or the last layer, if you will, of this conflict of government starts with many of the ideals in which we hold. So as we're looking at this conflict between government and the citizens and trying to balance things such as liberty, order, and equality, these are the things that we are kind of thinking about as citizens and as government representatives in terms of our interpretation of the role of both citizen and government. The first thing is the idea of a limited government. Oftentimes, students, when they see limited government, think that I mean small government. That is not what this definition means in terms of government ideals. We will be talking about small versus big government later in the course. However, limited government in this definition is essentially everything that the government does that the citizens allow it to do. So if you think about it, very controversially in American history, we had a situation during World War II where the President of the United States rounded up Japanese Americans, put them into internment camps because we were afraid of spies during World War II. This would fit in the definition of limited government because the American people have allowed that to happen. Something as simple as the Donald Trump tax cuts, that is limited government because the American people have allowed that to happen. That can change over the course of history. So the idea of limited government can change as well. Obviously, going back to the issue of Japanese Americans in internment camps, we see the conflict here, we see the problem, we don't allow that to happen anymore. So it is still an example of limited government. Government did something at the time that the citizens were all for. The government has since backed off of that, and obviously that is not something that we would tolerate today. So limited government is just the things that government is allowed to do because the citizens essentially give it permission. The second part to this, or the first kind of branch of this idea of limited government, is the idea of natural rights. Those of you that took AP European history probably talked a lot about John Locke. John Locke was the one that came up with the idea of natural rights. And we've kind of incorporated this into our own government, as you will see in a discussion about the Declaration of Independence and the idea of these natural rights. Life, liberty, and property, or what John Locke, tried to preach and write about in his writings of the Second Treatise of Government. We have adopted these in the Declaration of Independence as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that is one of the things that we are trying to protect, and it's the idea that God has given individuals rights, according to John Locke, and these are rights that you are born with. So as a human being, you are entitled to life, you are entitled to liberty, and you are entitled to property or the pursuit of happiness. The second part of this is the social contract, and that is the idea that the citizen and the government are okaying the ability of the government to govern. So it kind of branches off this idea of limited government in the fact that, the citizens have to okay the government for them to govern us, but then we also have to give the government power, and we give them the power through our rights of voting and who we put into office. So the social contract is something as well that kind of develops the relationship between the citizen and the government. Third, you have popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is quite simply the will of the people. Those of you in AP US history probably talked about this a little bit more last year than regular US history, but popular sovereignty was seen as one of the deciding factors when a state was becoming, when a territory was becoming a state prior to the Civil War. Popular sovereignty was determining whether or not that state was going to be slave or free. Popular sovereignty, again, is just the will of the people. We see this in many of the different types of elections. a senatorial election, a House election, a gubernatorial election. Those are all most votes wins. I hesitate to say presidential election because it is not necessarily popular sovereignty. That is a different ideal in government, and we'll talk about that in a second. But popular sovereignty is simply the will of the people, and that's one of the things that in a limited government we have to consider is what is exactly the people, or what exactly do the people want. You have separation of powers within a limited government, so it can make it very difficult for government to get a lot finished and accomplished. But you do have power that is going to be divided so as to protect from some sort of tyrannical government, as we saw with England prior to 1776. The separation of powers is going to make sure that the executive doesn't gain too much power or the legislative doesn't gain too much power, and it's going to maintain that ability of government to govern by also protecting the rights of the citizens. Finally, we have republicanism, and republicanism is not or does not have anything to do with the Republican Party in this context. Republicanism is just the idea that we have people who speak on our behalf. So while we do have popular sovereignty, while we do believe in the will of the people, we also believe in the right of the government to make decisions on behalf of the will of the people. This is seen a lot of times in our representatives. Yes, our representatives are supposed to listen to us, but also they have information that they might know that we don't, that they think a decision is going to be better for the country than what the people are saying. So there is that ability as well for the government to check the power of the people. This is an example of what I would call the Electoral College, as republicanism would be an example of this. The Electoral College, they do take into consideration the popular vote, but as we saw in 2016 and as we saw in the election of 2000, the popular vote is not everything. It is actually boiled down to the electors in this sense and the representatives that we hold in the Electoral College. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the presidency and also the elections later in the year. So I don't really care that you know a ton about that right now, but I just want you to understand the idea that republicanism is Americans being represented by somebody and somebody speaking on their behalf. To summarize this, what we really see is a balancing act between all of these ideals. The basic conflict is government power versus the rights of citizens. But our government and our people also have to be willing to look at what is trying to be done, either by an action of government or by a reaction of citizens. Is it the will of the people? Are we taking liberty away from the people? Or is it government that's trying to do something that maybe to protect equality that maybe the people weren't looking at out of their freedoms and their liberties and their natural rights? So I don't necessarily care that you know this particular slide in terms of a test or anything like that. I would never ask you to put these things on a correct side of the balance beam here, but I do want you to see that this, the main conflict is government power versus the rights of the citizens, but also that we are constantly trying to balance the other 8 or 9 different things that are in here, that we're trying to maintain this order, but also provide equality. And by providing equality, that might take away some of our natural rights, so on and so forth. So in looking at the ideals of government, we are in a constant balancing act, and it's something that we are going to continue to do as we move forward. And the balance can move, or the scale can move, depending on where we are in history. So right now, I would say that we are in a time that is very much leaning towards government power with COVID-19 and things like that. Government is definitely taking some of that control. And because of that, you're seeing separation of powers oftentimes go away. You're seeing limited government maybe go away, and you're seeing liberty go away. But this scale will transition at some point back in the other direction. We are constantly balancing between the two. So just as a basic understanding, have an idea of what these ideals are and how they sort of interact with each other to play out in that balancing act of government power versus the rights of the citizens. That is all I have for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to either ask them in class or send me a message, and I'd be more than happy to answer them the next time we get together. Thank you.